ClancyPasta presents Why My Parents Never Celebrated Halloween, written by Schaeffer Nelson. My family never celebrated Halloween. It wasn't because we were religious. I wasn't homeschooled. Nothing like that. We were pretty secular people, actually. Only went to church when Grandma was in town for the holidays. Nobody had to tell me Santa was fake, because no one ever told me Santa was real. I said pretty secular, though. Even though we didn't believe in a lot of things that our neighbors did, we believed in one thing that none of them did, and that was Mr. Wilson. My parents first told me about Mr. Wilson when I was 6. It's one of my earliest memories. It's the first time I remember them ever speaking with me in a serious tone. I even remember most of what they said. "Tonight's a special night of the year, son. It's called Halloween. And every year on Halloween, we have to go down into the basement and lock the door. And then we have to go into the special room underneath the basement and lock that door. And we can't come out until morning." I started to cry. I had seen that door in the basement floor. It scared me. I didn't want to go down inside it, and though I can't remember it now, I must have already gone down into it every year of my life prior. I was too young to ask questions. I just remember crying as Mom and Dad turned off all the lights in the house, and the three of us went downstairs, and then down again, into the room below the basement. I hated it down there. It was dark and cold, and the walls were always damp, and there were no windows, except the small peephole in the door above. And anytime he wasn't peeking through it, Dad kept that closed. The room wasn't quite tall enough for Dad to stand in, so we sat on couch cushions and waited. And while we waited, Mom would tell me the story of Mr. Wilson. "Sweetie, you were a miracle baby. Your daddy and I, we weren't supposed to be able to have children. And one Halloween night, as I was handing out candy to the kids who came to the door, I just burst into tears. I was so sad, sweetie, that I would never get to meet you. And your daddy knew exactly why I was crying, and he started crying too. Then someone else came to the door. A tall man with a kind face, and his name was Mr. Wilson. He told us a way that we could meet you, and we wanted to meet you so bad, sweetie, that we did what he said." When I asked Mom what Mr. Wilson had told them to do, she just said, "All you need to know is that it worked. You're here." Then she sighed and looked at Daddy. "But the reason we come down here on Halloween is that we thought after we got you, Mr. Wilson would go away and leave us alone. But he didn't. He comes back every year." I asked Mom why Mr. Wilson came back. She answered, "He wants something, and we're not going to give it to him." I asked why that meant we had to go to the room under the basement. Mom said, "You know how this room scares you?" I nodded. "It scares Mr. Wilson too. That's why your daddy built it." This explanation satisfied me. I still feared Halloween and Mr. Wilson, but my curiosity was satisfied. Until I was 12, right at the age when my friends started noticing that I didn't come out on Halloween, started grilling me for answers. My mom had told me never to tell anyone about what we did on Halloween or why, but middle school boys have ways of being persuasive. And eventually, I let a few things slip. The following Halloween, my parents and I hid in the room under the basement as usual, but not long after, we heard the sound of glass shattering upstairs. My parents looked at each other with fear. My dad opened the peephole and put his ear to it, trying to determine what was happening up there. It sounds like a couple of kids. My stomach sank. I knew this was my fault. And sure enough, we heard the sound of my schoolmate's voice, calling out, "Beware, beware! It's Mr. Wilson! I've come to get you!" Then the voice burst into giggles, along with two others. I braced myself. I assumed my parents would be furious with me, and in the days to come they would be. But not at that moment. At that moment, they just went deathly still. Mom put her hands over my ears. She told me to try to go to sleep. Of course, I couldn't, but I didn't dare disobey any further. I pretended to fall asleep, all the while listening intently for whatever sounds could penetrate my mom's hands. At first, all I could hear were scattered giggles, and then the giggles stopped. I heard another voice, a deeper voice, the voice of a much older man. My mom's hands got cold against my ears. I heard what sounded like a scuffle and a chorus of high-pitched screams, and then silence again. The silence broke with the sound of the basement door breaking open. Mom pulled me in tight. Heavy footsteps crashed down the basement stairs, like a horse was coming down. The heavy, rushing footsteps careened around the basement, and the deep voice, much nearer now, bellowed, "Where is he? Where is he? Where is the boy?" My dad crawled over to us and covered us both with his body. The footsteps finally barreled straight towards the door into our room below. They stopped on top of the door. It groaned under the weight. "Those aren't the ones I wanted. Not those filthy, rotten children up there. Where is the boy you owe me?" I was crying. All of us were. But Mom was right. Mr. Wilson didn't come into the room below. He could have broken in. I was sure of it, but he didn't. He didn't leave, either. He stood on top of the door for what seemed like all night, yelling over and over, "Where is the boy you promised me? Is he in there? Is he down below with you? Give him to me. Surrender the boy." At some point, I passed out, from terror and crying and exhaustion. And when I woke up, it was morning, and Mr. Wilson was gone. Not that our troubles were over. Dad and Mom actually spent a night in jail as persons of interest. They were released when the police realized that, even though the murders had occurred in our living room, there was no way my parents could have committed them. The only explanation was that boys had broken into the house and that some kind of animal had followed them inside. I went back to school the next week, a changed boy. Quieter, less friendly, traumatized. And also regarded differently. 3 kids die in your living room on Halloween night, you're not going to be invited to a lot of birthday parties. And I wasn't. My friends abandoned me, one by one. And even the ones that took mercy on me, they would never, ever come to my house. And we stayed in that house. We had to. My parents decided that, despite being neighborhood outcasts, the house had proved true in one crucial regard. That room under the basement, it had worked. It had kept us safe. It had kept him out. After we reinforced the windows and front doors, the next few Halloweens were uneventful. We did our usual ritual, and no one entered our home. But as my social life dwindled and loneliness led to depression, I grew into a belligerent teen. Defiant and angry, I grew to hate my parents for the life I was forced to live. I treated them with spite. I made them cry regularly. I was awful to them, but they were increasingly the only real relationships I had. It didn't help that they wouldn't tell me. After the incident with the boys upstairs, I begged my parents to explain to me what Mr. Wilson was screaming about. Why did Mr. Wilson want me so badly? My parents never budged. They wouldn't tell me a thing. Not until I threatened to open the door. I was 15, and I was done. I was so done. I was ready to run away, to start a new life. My parents were done too. They constantly bickered. They were so starved for affection from me that their behavior became increasingly bizarre and embarrassing. My dad lost his job. And Halloween night rolled around. And as we prepared to lock ourselves into the room below the basement, I refused to go inside. They tried to drag me in, but I had brought a kitchen knife with me. I wielded it at them. I demanded answers, or I would open the front door. Mom was already in the room below the basement, looking up at me. Something changed in her eyes. Dad stood on the steps between us, frozen with anxiety. Then Mom called up. "Boy, if that's what you want, do it." My face went ashen. So did my father's. Mom grabbed Dad by the waist and pulled him into the room below the basement. As he crashed on the floor, she grabbed hold of the door and the floor and slammed it shut. The lock clicked, and I was alone, outside of the room, and night was falling. I thought about banging on the door, begging Mom and Dad to let me back inside, but I couldn't. I'd crossed too many lines. The knife I'd pointed at my own parents was still in my hand. I stood in that spot, above the door in the basement floor, for a long time. Finally, I mounted the stairs out of the basement. I locked the door behind me, tight. I wasn't sure where I wanted to be when he came. My room? The living room? Should I leave the house entirely? I went to the living room window, opened the blinds, and looked out. Kids were everywhere. Costumes, trick-or-treating. I had never done that. Not once. I had always wanted to, always resented not being allowed to. And each kid or group of kids had a parent with them. A normal, loving parent who took them trick-or-treating, who provided a simple life, who didn't make them hide in the ground. The adults that wandered the neighborhood street all looked happy, because they were swarmed by happy, bouncing children. All except for one. At the end of the block, walking slowly up the street, a man, a tall man, with a long beard. It hung out of his brown robes like a monk's robes, but a monk from a very long time ago. I stopped breathing, and as if the old man sensed it, he stopped walking. He stood still on the sidewalk, and he raised his head. He looked at my house. He saw. His hands raised to his face, he clutched the sides of his beard. His jaw dropped open. And I wanted back in the room beneath the basement. I wanted back in it right now. My parents wouldn't let me back in. They had to. I fled the living room screaming in fear. I slammed down into the basement and flung myself at the door in the floor. I tried frantically to tug it open. "Mom, Dad, please." I jerked at the door with my whole body. "Please, let me in." At last, my dad's voice rose up from the ground. "No, son, no." There was a moment of silence. Dad continued. "You were right. This is no way to live. It's not worth it anymore. We wish you well. We love you very much. Now, go. Let this end." and the doorbell rang. I stood up, wiped the dust off the knees of my pants, walked up out of the basement, and then up to the front door. I answered it. There he stood, his hands outstretched, his eyes huge, the eyes of a man who is starving to death. He leapt at me. I screamed, bracing myself for pain, but Mr. Wilson did not attack me. He pulled me deep into his brown robes, pulled me so tight I could feel his ribcage against my own. My face was pressed. I could see nothing but fabric. When I gasped for air, I gagged on his smell, the smell of rotting meat. I felt his fingers burrow into my hair, his breath enter my ear, his lips against my forehead. "Boy," he wheezed. "My boy." He held me tight for a long time, and when his grasp loosened, I asked, "Are you my real father, Mr. Wilson?" Mr. Wilson smiled. "No, boy. There are no fathers. There are no mothers. There are no families. Do you remember being born?" I shook my head. "Your birth never occurred. No one is born. Not the one you called mother or the one you called father." I was beginning to feel dizzy. I asked, "Then why did you come for me?" "I am a lender. Every human has one." I told Mr. Wilson he was a liar, that what he was saying was ludicrous. No other child was raised like me. Just look outside. The streets were full of children who didn't spend one night a year inside a bunker. Mr. Wilson released me. He stepped back. He lowered his gaze to the floor. He spat. "Those children outside, their lenders are fools. Filthy, rotten fools. Abandoners, leaving their children to wallow in the delusion of human family, in the myth of biological pregnancy." Mr. Wilson flung his arms wide again and pulled me in. "You were lucky, child. When I lent you out, I never let you go." He wrapped his arm around my waist and guided me out the door. "Where are we going, Mr. Wilson?" "Everywhere, boy." He drew a line across the horizon. "Everywhere above the ground, we will go." I asked one more question. "Mr. Wilson, if no one is really born, does that mean no one dies?" Mr. Wilson looked down at me and smiled. His teeth were rotten and stained with blood. He said, "Oh, my boy, they die. The unlucky ones, the abandoned ones, the ones whose lenders never stand guard, never keep watch over the children they have lent out, like sheep without a shepherd. Oh, how they die." Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. I want to give a huge thanks to all of my supporters over at Patreon and YouTube memberships. Your support makes these narrations possible, and I appreciate it a ton. If you'd like to join these lovely ghouls, you can head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/ClancyPasta, or click the join button below to become a member. And if you'd like creepy cool shirts, make sure to head on over and check out my official merch store for some awesome tees, hoodies, stickers, and more. Alright, thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great night. Cheers.